The chandelier above the Harrington estate glittered like 1,000 tiny suns, spilling gold light over the marble floors. Guests in gowns and tuxedos glided across the ballroom, their laughter ringing through the air as champagne flutes clinked. Richard Harrington stood at the center of it all, the master of his kingdom. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and silver-haired, his navy suit pressed so sharply it could cut. On his wrist gleamed a gold watch worth more than some of the cars parked outside. His blue eyes scanned the room with a mixture of ownership and boredom. These people were not his peers. They were his audience. He thrived on the subtle bows of respect, the eager smiles that bent just a little too far, the way everyone wanted a piece of him. Angela Brooks moved quietly in the background, carrying a tray of drinks. Her white blouse was freshly ironed, her dark jeans plain, her shoes simple flats that tapped softly against the polished floor. She walked with the careful grace of someone who had long since learned to make herself invisible. To the guests, she was just part of the scenery, another uniform in the Harrington mansion. But her warm brown skin glowed under the lights, her curls tied back neatly, her deep brown eyes steady and observant. It happened so quickly. One of the guests, a senator's wife with too much perfume and too little patience, complained about the champagne. Richard, in his endless hunger to appear flawless, turned his head sharply. His gaze landed on Angela like a knife. Angela, his voice boomed, cutting across the ballroom chatter. Conversation stilled. Every eye shifted toward her. She froze, tray balanced in her hands. "Yes, sir?" Richard's lip curled. "Do you know the difference between vintage champagne and whatever swill you've been pouring?" A ripple of awkward laughter passed through the crowd. Angela swallowed, her throat tightening. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll correct it." But Richard wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking like a judge's gavel. "Sorry? Do you think sorry fills the glasses of my guests? Do you think sorry makes me look competent when you can't manage the simplest task?" The senator's wife gave a thin smile, satisfied. The crowd shifted, some hiding smirks, others uncomfortable but silent. Angela lowered her gaze, her chest rising and falling in controlled breaths. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held the tray steady. Richard leaned in, his voice sharp enough for everyone to hear. "If you can't handle serving drinks, maybe you should consider a job more fitting to your abilities. Scrubbing floors, perhaps, or better yet, stay invisible like you were meant to." The words echoed like gunfire. For a long moment, the room was silent. Angela's cheeks burned, but her eyes flickered, not with tears, but with something harder, something unbroken. She straightened, bowed her head slightly, and walked away with quiet dignity. Richard turned back to his guests with a satisfied smirk, as though nothing had happened. Laughter rose again, brittle and forced, but the humiliation hung in the air like smoke. And though Richard Harrington couldn't see it, a storm had begun to form, one that would one day sweep him from his pedestal. The ballroom music throbbed faintly through the walls as Angela pushed the swinging door open and slipped into the mansion's grand kitchen. The sound of violins and laughter dulled behind her, replaced by the clatter of pans, the hiss of boiling pots, and the low murmur of the staff. Here, the glittering perfection of Richard Harrington's empire cracked. The kitchen was hot, crowded, and chaotic. Cooks shouted over one another, waiters darted in and out with trays, and the air smelled of roasted meat and wine. Angela set her tray down on the counter and took a breath. Her chest still burned from the sting of Richard's words, but she forced her face into calm. The staff knew her well. Quiet Angela, the one who worked shifts no one else wanted, who stayed late, who smiled even when the world gave her no reason to. "Angela," whispered Rosa, another maid with sharp eyes and quick hands. "You okay?" Angela nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I'm fine." Rosa gave her a look that said she didn't believe a word of it. "I heard him. Everyone heard him." A young waiter shook his head as he stacked empty glasses. "That man's got no shame, talking to you like that in front of everybody." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. "He doesn't see me. To him, I'm just part of the furniture." Rosa leaned closer. Maybe tonight's the last straw. You've got more dignity than he'll ever have. Angela's eyes softened. Rosa always had fire in her, but Angela had learned that fire could burn you if you weren't careful. Don't let him hear you say that, Angela murmured, but Rosa didn't care. Let him. Somebody needs to. The kitchen door burst open again, and the head butler strode in, face red from exertion. Move, people. Mr. Harrington wants dessert trays out in 5 minutes. The staff scrambled, but Rosa stayed close to Angela. You know what I think? One day, he's going to push too far. And when that day comes, the whole world will see him for what he is. Angela didn't answer. She picked up a stack of clean glasses and steadied her hands. But inside, Rosa's words settled deep, because Angela had felt something shift in that ballroom. A flicker of anger from the crowd, a silence too heavy to ignore. She remembered the way Richard's words echoed, the way his guests had looked at her, then quickly away. Shame didn't just belong to her. It belonged to everyone who had stood by and watched. And somewhere inside her, a thought began to form. What if invisibility wasn't her curse? What if it was her weapon? The door swung open again, and Angela forced her face back into calm. She had work to do. But for the first time, she didn't feel small. She felt waiting. Like the storm Rosa spoke, was already on the horizon. The gala reached its crescendo. The chandeliers glittered like frozen fire above the ballroom. The orchestra swelled, and the crowd moved with a rhythm that only wealth seemed to grant. Politicians laughed over wine. CEOs closed deals with a handshake, and society's elite basked in their own reflections. Richard Harrington stood at the center of it all. His navy suit gleamed under the lights, his silver hair slicked back with precision. He laughed loudly, a man who believed the room belonged to him. To everyone else, he was the room. Angela slipped in quietly from the kitchen, balancing another tray of glasses. She weaved between the guests, invisible in her black and white uniform, her face composed. Yet her heart beat with an unfamiliar rhythm, sharp and insistent. Richard's voice cut through the music. Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention. The orchestra trailed into silence. All eyes turned toward him as he stepped onto the small stage near the grand staircase, microphone in hand. Tonight, Richard boomed, we celebrate not just wealth, but the progress it creates. The Harrington Foundation has given millions to innovation, education, and opportunity. His chest swelled with pride, because it is men like us, men of vision, who shape the future. Applause followed, though not as strong as Richard expected. Angela noticed a hesitation in the clapping, the faint shift in expressions. Some guests remembered his outburst earlier. The echo of his cruelty hadn't vanished. Richard basked in the spotlight anyway, smiling as if he were untouchable. Then it happened. A guest near the front, a professor Angela recognized by his gentle voice at dinner, raised a hand. Mr. Harrington, if I may ask, do you believe opportunity truly belongs to everyone? Richard laughed dismissively. Of course, anyone who works hard enough may rise. That is the beauty of merit. Angela froze. Something in her chest tightened. The words sounded hollow, cruel even after what he had done. The professor pressed further. But what of those who were silenced, who never received the chance to be heard? Richard's jaw stiffened. Then perhaps they have not earned the right. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The professor sat back, disappointed. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, pretending nothing had happened. And that's when Angela realized the room was holding its breath. The microphone, still in Richard's hand, lay open, unguarded. For just a moment, as he turned to take a sip of water, her tray trembled in her hands, and for reasons she couldn't explain, her feet carried her forward. Before she knew it, she was standing at the edge of the stage. Her voice, soft but steady, cut through the silence. Excuse me. Heads turned. The staff froze in place. Richard wheeled around, eyes narrowing when he saw who had spoken. Angela took a step onto the stage, her tray now resting on a nearby table. She didn't look at him. She looked at the crowd. I've served in this house for years, she began. Her voice carried more strength than she expected. I've cleaned your plates, refilled your glasses, and walked these floors invisible. But invisibility doesn't mean insignificance. The room was silent. Even the orchestra musicians leaned forward to listen. Richard hissed, "Get off the stage?" But Angela didn't move. She reached for the microphone, her hand brushing against his. For the first time, Richard Harrington felt resistance, real, immovable resistance, from someone he thought beneath him. And then she spoke into the microphone. "You want to know who shapes the future?" she asked, her voice trembling only at the edges. "It isn't just men in suits with fortunes. It's the people you don't see. The people who clean your tables, watch your children, drive your cars. The ones you dismiss until they speak." A murmur rose from the crowd. Angela pressed on. "I've listened tonight to talk of progress, of vision, of merit. But let me tell you what merit looks like. It looks like my mother, who worked 3 jobs so I could finish school. It looks like every worker in this kitchen, sweating so you can feast. It looks like me, standing here, even though every part of me is terrified." She glanced at Richard, his face rigid with rage. "Merit doesn't need your permission, Mr. Harrington. It only needs a voice." For a heartbeat, the ballroom was still. Then applause, soft at first, hesitant, but it grew, row by row, hand by hand, until the entire hall shook with clapping. Guests rose to their feet. Some whistled, some cheered. The sound crashed like a wave, drowning out Richard's fury. Angela stood at the center, the microphone trembling in her hand, her eyes wide with the enormity of what she had done. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. She was undeniable. Richard Harrington could only watch as the room he once commanded now rose for her. The applause rang in Angela's ears long after the gala ended. It wasn't just sound. It was validation, recognition. Something she had never felt in this house of marble and chandeliers. But applause fades, and when the last guest departed, silence returned like a shadow. Angela stood near the back of the hall, her tray empty, her hands trembling. She had spoken the truth, but the weight of it pressed heavy on her chest. Richard Harrington had not said a word since. He lingered near the staircase, jaw clenched, his cold blue eyes fixed on her as if she were a problem to be solved, not a woman who had just dismantled his authority. The staff whispered. Some looked at Angela with admiration, others with fear. No one had ever dared speak to Richard like that. No one had dared to stand where she stood. When the last chair was stacked, Richard finally spoke. His voice was low, sharp, and controlled. "In my house," he said, each word like glass breaking. "In my house, you humiliate me." Angela didn't flinch. "I told the truth." Richard stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. "You think truth matters here? This is a world of power, and power decides who speaks." Angela lifted her chin. Maybe it's time power listened for once. For the first time in years, Richard had no response. He turned sharply and walked away, his polished shoes clicking like gunfire on the marble. The ripple. By morning, Angela's words had already left the ballroom. A guest had recorded her speech on their phone, and the video spread like wildfire. Headlines appeared across social media. Maid silences Millionaire at his own gala. Angela Brooks, the voice they tried to ignore. Who really hold the power? Angela's phone buzzed endlessly. Calls, texts, messages from strangers who said she had spoken for them. People she had never met called her brave, called her inspiring, called her the hero they didn't know they needed. But not all voices were kind. Some called her ungrateful. Others called her reckless. Anonymous profiles flooded her inbox with venom. "Stay in your place. You don't belong on that stage." She ignored them. For every hateful word, there were 10 more telling her, "Thank you." Richard's war. Richard Harrington's world, however, was crumbling. Overnight, his name wasn't tied to wealth and prestige. It was tied to arrogance, racism, and humiliation. His foundation board members demanded answers. Investors called with concerns. Even his own children sent messages. Furious at the way he had treated Angela. In the privacy of his penthouse office, Richard smashed a glass against the wall. For decades, he had been untouchable. Now one speech, delivered by a maid, had cracked the empire he built. But Richard was no man to accept defeat. He plotted. He hired publicists, lawyers, strategists. He rehearsed apologies that never made it past his lips. Pride and survival waged war in his chest. And beneath it all, a question haunted him. Why did her words cut so deep? Angela's choice. Opportunities flooded in. Journalists wanted interviews. Activists invited her to speak at rallies. Universities offered scholarships. But Angela was cautious. She had not spoken to be famous. She had spoken because silence had become unbearable. One evening, she sat at her small kitchen table, her daughter Nia asleep in the next room. Angela stared at the glow of her phone, dozens of unanswered messages blinking back at her. She whispered to herself, "What now?" Her reflection in the window looked back, weary but unbroken. She knew the path ahead would not be easy. The powerful would not forgive her for exposing them. Richard Harrington would not forgive her. But the truth was out, and once spoken, truth cannot be buried. Angela Brooks was no longer just a maid. She was a voice, and the world was listening. Richard Harrington had always known how to fight. Deals rival competitors. He crushed them with contracts, lawyers, and money. But this was different. He wasn't battling a corporation. He was battling a voice, a maid's voice, and the world loved her for it. His board was restless. His investors whispered about replacing him. Magazines that once praised his genius now printed headlines like the fall of a titan. Everywhere he turned, there was Angela's name, Angela's face, Angela's words. He slammed his fist against his oak desk one evening, shouting to the empty room, "She's nothing. She's no one. How dare she undo me?" But the truth lingered in the silence. She had undone him because she spoke what no one else would. The counterattack. Richard hired a team, not just publicists, but investigators. He wanted dirt, anything to discredit her. They combed through Angela's life, her bank records, her employment history, her family ties. One morning, Angela opened her phone to see a headline that made her blood run cold. Angela Brooks, hero or hypocrite? The article painted her as irresponsible, exaggerated her debts, twisted her past struggles into flaws. The comments were brutal. Strangers who once called her brave now sneered. She's no role model. She's a fraud. Angela sat at her kitchen table, her daughter's cereal bowl still half full beside her, and felt the weight of it crash over her. For a moment, fear pressed against her chest. What if they succeeded? What if they erased her before she had even begun? But then she remembered that night at the gala, the faces in the crowd, the way they had stood, clapped, cheered, not because she was flawless, but because she was real, and that gave her strength. The turning point. Angela agreed to an interview, not with a tabloid, but with a respected journalist who had reached out quietly. She sat in a modest studio, the cameras rolling, and told her story, her whole story. She spoke of the double shifts, the nights she went without sleep, the sacrifices she made to raise her daughter. She spoke of the humiliation she endured in silence. And she spoke of the moment she realized silence was no longer an option. The interview aired. Millions watched. And once again the tide shifted, because people didn't see a fraud. They saw themselves. They saw their mothers, their fathers, their neighbors. They saw the truth, that dignity lives in everyone, not just in those with money. Richard's breaking point. Meanwhile, Richard's empire continued to bleed. Contracts slipped away. His board voted to strip him of certain powers. For the first time in his career, Richard Harrington felt powerless. Late one night, he stood before the mirror in his penthouse bathroom. His silver hair slicked back perfectly, his tailored suit flawless. Yet his reflection mocked him. His eyes, cold and blue, now looked hollow. He whispered to himself, "She's just a maid. Why can't I defeat her?" But deep down, he knew the answer. Power built on arrogance cannot silence truth forever. Angela's stand. The breaking point came at a public forum weeks later. Angela was invited to speak on a panel about dignity and labor rights. She stood on stage, the lights hot on her face, hundreds in the audience watching. Midway through her speech, a voice called from the back. Cold, sharp, unmistakable. Richard Harrington. He stood, his frame as commanding as ever, and walked slowly down the aisle until he was in front of the stage. The room buzzed, cameras flashing, whispers erupting. Angela froze, her heart pounding. The man who had tried to bury her now stood face to face with her in front of the world. Richard raised a microphone handed to him and said, "Angela Brooks, you humiliated me. You destroyed my name. But tonight I ask, do you really believe you can build something better than I have?" The audience went silent. Angela looked at him, steady and unflinching. And in that silence, she knew the world was waiting, not for Richard's answer, but for hers. The gala hall shimmered with golden light, chandeliers dripping elegance like diamonds frozen in motion. Waiters glided between marble columns, balancing trays of champagne, their footsteps barely a whisper against a crimson carpet. Outside, the city buzzed with horns and neon, but inside, silence hovered like anticipation before a storm. Angela stood in the shadow of the grand staircase, clutching the edge of her apron. For hours she had been invisible, moving between tables, pouring drinks, clearing plates. Just another uniform, just another servant. Her life had been measured in footsteps, trays, and polite smiles. But that night, something was different. The businessman, Richard Harrington, had seen to that. Earlier, his voice had cut across the hall, sharp as glass. "Careful, Maid. You nearly spilled it. Do you know what the suit costs? More than your yearly wage." His laughter had spread across the table of investors. Each chuckle another nail hammered into Angela's pride. She had lowered her eyes, whispered an apology, and walked away. On the outside, she was calm. Inside, she was fire. And now, hours later, fate twisted the night in ways Richard never expected. The gala chairwoman, a woman with steel gray hair and a voice that commanded attention, tapped her glass with a spoon. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, before our closing remarks, we have a special address. An employee of this very hotel has requested the stage, and we decided to give her the floor." The crowd stirred. Murmurs rolled through the Golden Room. Employees never spoke at these events. What could a maid possibly have to say? Angela's heart pounded as the spotlight swung toward her. Her hands trembled, but not with fear, with resolve. She wasn't just carrying words. She was carrying every humiliation, every dismissal, every time someone had made her small. Tonight, she would stand tall. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Oh, this should be good. The help wants to lecture us." His voice dripped arrogance. His friends chuckled. But when Angela stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Her presence was undeniable. She didn't wear a gown. She didn't carry jewels. Her uniform was plain, black slacks, white blouse, apron. Yet the light wrapped around her like armor, and her eyes burned with a truth that could not be ignored. She reached the podium, gripping it firmly, and for a moment, she said nothing. Silence can be louder than words, and Angela knew how to use it. She let the tension grow until even the most powerful men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Finally, she spoke. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight. I was supposed to clear your plates, refill your glasses, and smile when you snapped your fingers. But sometimes, life gives you a stage when you least expect it." A ripple of surprise passed through the audience. Richard leaned forward, irritation flickering in his cold blue eyes. "Get on with it." Angela's gaze cut across the room and landed squarely on him. "Mr. Harrington," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "You may not remember every person you stepped on in your climb to wealth, but we remember you." Gasps fluttered across the audience. People turned toward Richard. He stiffened. Angela continued. "You think dignity has a price tag. You measure people by their wallets, their suits, their status. You believe that because you can sign checks, you can silence voices. But let me tell you something." She paused, her voice gaining strength. "The world is changing, and no amount of money can stop the truth." The room was riveted. Guests who had once been whispering now leaned forward, hanging on every word. Richard stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "This is outrageous. I will not be insulted by—" "Sit down," someone whispered from the back. It wasn't just a whisper. It was agreement. Others began murmuring too, their voices low but firm. The tide was turning. Angela looked directly at him. "You silenced me earlier with your laughter. Tonight, I silence you with truth." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Her hands were steady now. She laid it on the podium, unfolding it slowly, deliberately. "I wasn't always a maid. I studied. I worked. I had dreams. But dreams don't pay rent when doors are slammed shut in your face. Tonight, I'm going to share something I've carried for years, not for myself, but for every person who's been told they don't belong." The crowd shifted. Even the waiters paused mid-step. She began to read. Her words painted a story, not of servitude, but of brilliance. Equations she had scribbled in the margins of receipts. Poems she had written on scraps of napkins. Ideas she had buried because the world told her they weren't hers to voice. Each line was a revelation. The audience listened in stunned silence. And with every sentence, Richard's face reddened, his arrogance cracking like glass under pressure. He tried to interrupt. "This is absurd. None of this means anything." But this time, no one laughed with him. No one nodded. No one defended him. Instead, a voice in the crowd shouted, "Let her finish." Applause followed, soft at first, then louder, until it became a wave crashing against the walls of the hall. Angela lifted her chin, her voice carrying to the storm of clapping hands. "You see, power is not in your money. It's not in your title. It's not in your name. Real power is in truth and in the courage to speak it." The audience was on its feet now. The same people who had once ignored her now cheered. Strangers with jewels and silk gowns stood shoulder to shoulder with busboys and maids, united in applause. Richard stood frozen, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control. His empire of fear and arrogance had collapsed in seconds. Angela stepped back from the podium. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply stood tall, breathing deeply, absorbing the roar of a crowd that had finally seen her, truly seen her. And in that moment, the maid was no longer invisible. She was unforgettable. The echo of applause followed her off the stage, a sound Richard would never forget, and a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Because the truth was undeniable. The maid he mocked had stolen the night. The echoes of applause from that night at the gala refused to die. Days later, the newspapers were still buzzing, television anchors still replaying the moment when a maid in uniform silenced a millionaire in his own world. Angela Brooks's name was everywhere now. The headline that cut the deepest was one Richard Harrington could not escape: the maid who spoke truth to power. It appeared in every major outlet. He tried to drown it out with phone calls, lawyers, damage control meetings, but the words burned into him like a brand. His empire had not fallen overnight. No. His bank accounts were still full. His penthouse still glittered above the city skyline. But something more fragile than money had cracked. His image, his control, his place at the top of the social ladder, where men like him never expected to be challenged. Worse, business partners began to distance themselves. Investors suddenly had scheduling conflicts. Invitations to exclusive circles dried up. Behind closed doors, Richard Harrington had become a liability. For the first time in years, he was alone. Angela, meanwhile, felt the strange weight of sudden visibility. The hotel where she once scrubbed floors treated her like a guest of honor now. Colleagues who had avoided eye contact before now smiled warmly, eager to be near her. Guests whispered her name as she passed. Some asked for selfies. Others pressed folded notes into her hand. "Call me if you ever need a sponsor. Call me if you want to tell your story on my platform." But Angela wasn't chasing fame. She wanted something deeper. She sat at her kitchen table late at night, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, staring at the same piece of paper she had pulled from her apron pocket at the gala. Her scribbles of equations and words weren't just abstract thoughts. They were the fragments of her dream. To build, to teach, to inspire. Her daughter, little Nia, climbed into her lap one night and asked, "Mommy, are you famous now?" Angela smiled faintly, brushing her daughter's curls back. "Not famous, baby, just finally heard." And that was enough. Or so she thought. One week after the gala, her phone rang. She nearly didn't answer when she saw the name flash across the screen. Richard Harrington. Her thumb hovered over decline, but something in her chest made her press accept. The line was heavy with silence before Richard finally spoke. His voice had lost its bark, its edge. "Angela, we need to talk." Angela leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing. "About what? Another insult you forgot to throw at me?" "No." Richard exhaled, and she could almost hear the sound of his pride crumbling. "About what happened. About what you started. I can't ignore it anymore." Angela said nothing. She let him twist in the silence. Finally, he whispered, "Please, meet me, just once." Against her instincts, Angela agreed. Not because she owed him anything, but because she wanted to see what a man like Richard Harrington looked like when the mask of arrogance was gone. They met in the quiet hush of an old library, a place chosen by Richard, perhaps because it was neutral ground, perhaps because even men like him respected the weight of books and history. The table between them was polished oak, reflecting the lamplight. Richard sat stiffly in his tailored navy suit, but his face betrayed something new. Humility. His cold blue eyes no longer pierced like ice. They searched, restless, almost pleading. Angela, dressed simply but with quiet strength, leaned back in her chair. She didn't need power suits or jewels. Her presence was enough. "Do you realize what you did that night?" Richard began, his voice low. Angela raised an eyebrow. "You mean, do I realize I embarrassed you?" His jaw tightened. "No, you changed the conversation. You made people like me stop and listen. That doesn't happen often." Angela folded her arms. "And what do you want from me, Richard?" Silence hung heavy before he answered. "I want to help you." Angela laughed, not cruelly, but with disbelief. "Help me? You mocked me in front of hundreds of people. You made me invisible my whole life. And now you want to help me?" "Yes." His voice cracked slightly, the weight of the word pulling it down. "Because I realized something. My money, my deals, my empire, none of it means anything if I can't see the humanity in the people around me. You forced me to see it, and I don't want to go back." Angela's eyes narrowed, scanning his face for signs of manipulation. But what she saw instead was exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying arrogance for too long. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I saw what happened after that night," Richard said. "People stood up for you. People stood with you. And me? They turned away. I've spent my whole life silencing voices like yours. And for the first time, I wonder if I've been silencing myself too." Angela's silence was her power. She let him struggle to fill it. "I can fund your projects," Richard said finally. "Your equations, your ideas. You have brilliance that the world needs. I don't want credit. I don't want publicity. I just want to be part of something real before I die." Angela's gaze softened, but only slightly. "And what if I don't trust you?" Richard nodded slowly. "Then I'll accept that. But I had to try." The weeks that followed were filled with choices. Angela met with professors, activists, scientists who had heard her speak. Some wanted to mentor her, others to partner with her. Richard kept his distance, but every so often, he sent her quiet updates. Donations made in her name, scholarships funded for Maid's children, community centers sponsored anonymously. He was trying, not for applause, not for cameras, but for himself. And Angela? She wrestled with a question that would define her future. Could she forgive him? Not forget, not erase, but forgive enough to move forward? The final turning point came months later, at another gala. But this time, Angela was not carrying trays. She was a keynote speaker. The hall was filled with professors, students, community leaders. Her daughter Nia sat in the front row, eyes shining with pride. And in the back, almost invisible, Richard Harrington sat alone. No entourage, no fanfare, just a man listening. Angela spoke with fire and grace. She spoke of dignity, of equality, of the hidden brilliance in places society refuses to look. She spoke of maids, waiters, janitors, laborers, of the dreams they carried in silence. And when she finished, the hall erupted into a standing ovation. This time, Richard did not stand. He simply lowered his head, letting the applause wash over him like absolution. He did not deserve but desperately needed. Angela saw him there, and for a moment, their eyes met. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She simply nodded, a small gesture, but one that carried the weight of forgiveness. Not complete, not total, but enough. Because this story was never just about a maid and a millionaire. It was about dignity. It was about truth. It was about rewriting the script of who gets to be heard and who refuses to be silenced. And as Angela stepped down from the stage, hand in hand with her daughter, she knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning.